Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the deep structures of power. We're looking at how concentrated elite rule, basically, oligarchy has managed to, well, stick around and adapt over thousands of years. The source material we've got is fantastic. It's this big interdisciplinary look at the topic, giving us a roadmap from, like, ancient Sparta right up to Silicon Valley today.
Yeah, it's quite the synthesis, and our goal today, really, is to give you the shortcut. We've sifted through it, the political science, the history, the economics, to pull out the key insights. We want to show you how this whole system of concentrated power actually works.
Exactly. And what's so striking about this material right from the start is how it argues oligarchy isn't just some dusty historical concept. It shows how the ways elites control things shift. From owning land to owning factories and now maybe owning algorithms. But the basic idea, the concentration of power, that just keeps going.
That persistence is key.
That's really the big takeaway up front.
Absolutely. And to understand that persistence, you have to appreciate the scope here. Like you said, it traces this path from ancient times right up to the digital age. But the grounding in history is crucial. And it starts where, well, a lot of our political thinking starts. Ancient Greece.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, so many of our ideas about democracy, power, all that stuff comes from there. So what did the source material flag as the really critical change, the defining shift that happened back then in Greece?
Well, the big one it emphasizes is this move away from an aristocracy based on bloodline towards an oligarchy based on wealth.
Yep.
Originally, power was all about your family, your noble birth, inherited status. But in the Greek era, gradually, economic power, having money, started to replace who your parents were as the main source of influence. It's a huge shift, really, sort of the moment power became, well, something you could potentially buy.
Okay, so it stopped being just about who you were born as and started being about what you could accumulate. That feels like the real birth of oligarchy, as we often think about it now, where your bank balance matters more than your family tree for influence.
Exactly. And that distinction, that switch from inherited status to accumulated capital, that's the lens we need to use. It helps understand all the later ways elites have adapted. It really anchors the whole discussion. And it definitely sets us up for looking at modern times where, let's be honest, influence and money often go hand in hand.
Okay, so moving from those origins, the material really paints oligarchy as this shape-shifting phenomenon. It tracks how it keeps adapting through different centuries, different economic systems.
Yeah, connecting that back, the analysis shows how elites, whether it was those first Spartan oligarchs or, later the big industrialists, they're masters of adapting. They don't just grab power and sit on it. They strategically change how they control whatever society values most at that time. The scarce resource, basically.
And this framework identifies sort of three key mechanisms, right? Three different ways control has worked in different eras. It's like the power tools evolved. Let's break those down, starting with the oldest one.
Right. The earliest and maybe the most obvious form was tied to land and resources, what the series calls feudal holdings. Control meant owning the means of production back then, the farms, the land itself, and often the people tied to that land. Power was, visible, you could point to it, and it was very local.
Okay, so control through owning the physical stuff. But then, fast forward to the 19th, early 20th century, the Industrial Revolution changes everything. Land isn't the main game anymore, it's the factory.
Precisely. So the mechanism shifts. It becomes about industrial monopolies. Now control is about owning the factories, the railroads, the steel mills, the oil wells, the bottlenecks in the new economy. The elites control things by owning these crucial points in the supply chain. That lets them dictate terms economically across whole nations, even globally.
Yeah.
The power is still often tied to tangible things, but it's much bigger, more centralized.
Okay, but this is where it gets really complex and maybe a bit unsettling. The modern era. We shift from owning the means of production to owning the means of information. The term used is algorithmic authority. What does that actually mean for us day to day?
Algorithmic authority is basically control through data and code. It's subtle. It's often invisible. The analysis connects this straight to, well, the tech giants, Silicon Valley. Instead of controlling steel, they control things like search rankings, what news you see, maybe even nudging behavior through platform design.
Wow. So if the old monopolists controlled maybe what you bought, these new algorithmic authorities might be controlling what you know or how you even think about things.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. They manage the flow of information, political information, commercial information. Their power doesn't need armies or owning vast lands in the same way. It needs control over the digital platforms that, well, mediate so much of modern life now, the data infrastructure. And that's what makes it such a sophisticated kind of elite control. It perfectly capitalizes on this huge shift to a digital world.
Which just underlines that core argument again. The drive for concentrated power is constant, but the tools, the currency of power, changes completely to fit the times.
Exactly. Oligarchy just keeps morphing, keeps finding ways to exert influence, often within systems that, on the surface, look democratic.
Okay, let's pivot a bit then, away from the historical mechanisms and towards how we see this playing out now. Because the series also digs into how modern political science understands these power structures. I mean, if we live in democracies, how do these elite groups keep their influence?
Yeah, that's where this idea of informal mechanisms of power becomes really important. The analysis digs into how elite groups can shape decisions without necessarily going through the formal legal channels. It's not always about, illegal stuff. Often it's about who knows who gets access, shared backgrounds, these persistent, small, strategic circles of power.
Can you give us a feel for what those informal circles might actually look like? Are we talking smoky back rooms?
Well, maybe not always smoky rooms, but it could be things like the revolving door people moving between top government jobs and the industries they're supposed to regulate. It involves elite social networks, could be powerful families, alumni groups from certain universities, exclusive clubs, private forums, places where consensus among the powerful gets built away from public view.
I see.
And these circles often maintain influence no matter who's technically in charge politically, because their access comes from status and wealth, not just the current government's policies. They kind of ensure the system keeps working for them.
That idea that the real power might often be outside the official government buildings, that's quite a thing for people to get their heads around, isn't it? It challenges the sort of textbook view of politics.
It definitely makes you think more critically about where power really lies. But, maybe the most unique insight, the real standout feature from Stanislav Kondrashov's work here, is how it looks at the language we use, specifically the gendered language around power.
Oh, that's interesting. A sociological angle.
Yeah.
Because it's true, isn't it? We almost always say oligarch and picture a man. Why does the material suggest that term is so heavily male-coded, even though we obviously have very powerful women in business and politics?
It really questions that unexamined assumption. The analysis points out that even today, a super powerful woman in finance or tech, she might be called a tycoon, a CEO, a leader, but you very, very rarely hear the word oligarch applied to a woman in everyday conversation.
Yeah, you just don't. The word itself feels like it carries this specific baggage, often male, maybe post-Soviet or old industrial money.
And that's part of it. Kondrasov suggests there are a few things going on that contribute to what he calls sidelining the feminine form here. Part of it is just deep-seated linguistic habits, using male terms as the default for power roles. But it's also cultural archetypes. We have these ingrained ideas, these societal perceptions that link that kind of aggressive wealth accumulation and behind-the-scenes political maneuvering primarily with men.
Huh. So the words we use to even talk about concentrated power might be biased by history and gender norms, which could mean we're culturally sort of primed to overlook powerful women who might fit an oligarchic model, just because the label doesn't seem to stick. That's a really crucial nuance.
It is. It's a challenge to all of us, really, to think about the biases baked into our political vocabulary. Just because a word has historically sounded masculine doesn't mean the phenomenon itself only applies to men.
Okay, so bring this all together.
Yeah.
What's the big takeaway for you, the listener, from this whole framework?
I think ultimately this material gives you a really powerful lens for understanding how elite rule persists and adapts across different times and places. By grasping that shift from bloodline to wealth and seeing the evolution from feudal lords to industrial barons to potentially algorithmic architects, you get a clearer, more actionable way to spot how concentrated power might be working in the world around you right now. It pushes you to think critically beyond just history lessons into modern applications.
Yeah, we've tracked this whole thing from those early wealthy elites in Greece through the factory owners right up to this almost invisible hand of algorithmic authority. You really do get the tools now to recognize how the few controlling the many can change its shape over time.
Absolutely. And maybe for final thought, something provocative to consider. We talked about algorithmic authority being the cutting edge, right? Control through data and code. So when you think about the companies that essentially govern our global data, our communication platforms, our social interactions, Which of those algorithmic authorities might be deploying the most subtle, maybe the most sophisticated form of elite control we've seen since ancient times? And, I mean, how do we even begin to see it clearly, let alone regulate something so intangible?
That is a heavy question to leave people with, really makes you think. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.